Hey sewers, thank you for joining me today. Today I'm going to be talking all about cutting and tracing out patterns. So a few different tools that I'm going to be using, which you might want to grab if you're also doing it with me, are a rotary knife or just fabric shears if you don't have a rotary knife. I use these little tiny snipping shears for cutting out notches. I'll talk more about that later. And you also need some sort of pattern weight. Any kind of weight will do. And I use toil, which is just a really cheap fabric because I'm making a pattern for the first time and I want to make sure that it fits me right before I use proper fabric and really nice fabric. So I have this fabric that I'm going to be using. And then as I'm tracing my patterns, I'm also using tracing paper. So I don't prefer to cut the pattern straight from the pattern itself. I make a copy of it just in case the size doesn't fit me. So grab your tools if you're going to be trying it along with me. And the pattern that I'm going to be tracing today is the gypsum skirt pattern from Sew Liberated. So if you happen to also want to be sewing this skirt, you can sew along with me. So I'll be talking just about tracing and cutting that pattern, and then I'll make a video soon, more like a sew along for this skirt pattern. All right, let's get started. I want to start with a term that you're going to hear me say often, and it's often referred to when you're cutting out patterns. So here you see I've cut out a pattern already. This is for a skirt that I'm going to be making. And on the pattern that I traced, you could see that I traced a long arrow and I copied that from the pattern. And this helps me know where the grain line should fall when I'm placing my pattern. So what I mean by the grain line is on your fabric that you're using. The grain line is the direction of the threads. So right now I'm looking at the selvage of the fabric. And the selvage is that part that hasn't been cut yet. So if you see the end of my fabric, this you can tell somebody cut along here. The selvage usually has like a little end. It's harder to tell because mine is white, but it's closed off. You can tell that that's the end. So this is the selvage. So when you're working with your pattern, and if you see the grain line, here's the grain line. The grain line should run parallel to the selvage. So if this is my selvage right here, I would lay my pattern flat like this because that arrow is showing that the grain line should be this way. So if I did it like that, it would not be parallel and I would be going against the grain line. So I'm gonna go this way when I copy it onto my fabric. I also wanted to talk for a quick second about the fabric that I'm using right now. It's just a really thin, sheer, cheap fabric, and it's a toil. And the reason why I'm tracing my pattern on this toil first is because I haven't made this skirt before. I don't know if the size is gonna fit me, and I don't wanna waste really good fabric. So I'm gonna start with this cheap version of fabric as I make a toil, and I'm going to trace out my patterns on this cheap fabric and make the skirt in its entirety, but I'll probably skip a few short steps just so I can fit it on my body and see how it fits and make adjustments when needed. So if you're working with a new pattern, I've just learned from other sewists that it's best to make a toil first just to get the right size. Before placing your pattern pieces on your fabric, you should have a picture like this in your pattern, whatever pattern you're working with. I happen to be working with Sew Liberated's gypsum skirt, and it even tells you and reminds you that you should be washing and drying your fabric, even pressing and ironing. I'm not going to iron mine because remember how I mentioned I'm just going to use a toil, so it's a really cheap fabric. And you're gonna see, usually it says right here what your fabric looks like. So it's 54 inches or 45 inches. That's just telling you the width of your fabric. So some fabric's a little bit more narrow and some is a little bit more wide. And this is a really helpful reference just for you to see like how you should be laying your pattern pieces on the fabric to make it fit the best. It also is showing you how to lay the pattern against the grain line. So right here, it's showing you that these are the self edges, and this is the direction that all of your pattern should be facing, so it's against the grain line. Also in my pattern, I have two pieces. This is the skirt, the back and the front of the skirt, that is right on the fold of the fabric. So you want to make sure that when you're looking at your pattern to be careful if it should be on the fold. So that way when you open it, it's a full front skirt and a full back skirt, or if it's placed in the middle of your fabric. So take a look at whatever pattern you're working with just to see how to lay it out. Sometimes I kind of figure out a different way to lay it out, but usually this is really helpful. Okay, so I've laid down my first piece from the pattern, and my table and my space that I'm using is not really big. So I'm just doing one piece of the pattern at a time, and then I'll shift my fabric over and work on the next piece in this area. So in my pattern in my book, the way that it had referenced is just what I showed you before. It says the front and the back should be lined up right on the fold of the fabric. So here's my fabric underneath. This is the folded side. And here's the selvage up here on the top of my fabric. So I made sure that my grain line is running parallel to the selvage. So it's parallel to the selvage. Everything's correct on that. And then just make sure that if it's on the fold like mine is, that the fold is pressed firmly down. And what I did was I just checked for any creases, made sure that the fabric and the pattern are both flat before you cut anything. I'm also using pattern weights. You can use anything for a pattern weight, really. You can get creative if you don't have what I have, obviously. And then you're also going to need some kind of cutting tool. I'm using a rotary knife, which I just really like for just the grip in my hand. If I'm using cutting shears, mine are pretty cheap. I don't have really fancy ones yet. But if I'm using cutting shears, I just feel like it's a little bit trickier. So with my rotary knife, I feel like I can get a straighter edge. So I'm going to show you just next how I cut this. All right, so I just double checked that everything was flat. If you iron your fabric, that'll make it a lot easier too. I didn't iron my toil. So then I have my rotary knife ready, and this is the way I hold my rotary knife. I also learned this from just watching other sewers. I was doing something like this, and now I'm doing that, and that's also why you could see on the rotary knife there's this little grip right here. So this is just like learning how to grip this rotary knife has been a game changer, because I was holding it like this for the longest time. So now I know, and now I'm showing you. Okay, so whatever I'm cutting, I'm also holding my other hand close by just to make sure that the fabric is flat down as I'm cutting. I want to get as close to the pattern as I can without cutting into the pattern. I've accidentally cut a tiny bit into the pattern, and that's okay. Like, it doesn't make a huge difference. I wouldn't stress out too much about accidentally cutting a tiny bit into it. So here's my skirt line. This is the waistline of my skirt. I know it's kind of hard to see because I'm using this white toil fabric. I'm sorry about that. But I'm trying to be as descriptive as I can. Now the side of my skirt runs this way. I'm just gonna cut all the way down, taking it little by little. My hand that's not cutting is again just checking for any creases, making sure that there's no bumps along the way. So that way the fabric is cut as true as it can be to the pattern and whatever size that you cut out. And then as I'm cutting it, before I just rip it open to see it, I'm gonna move it really slowly, because there might be little threads that are stuck that you didn't cut, and you might have to just roll it over again. But you can see mine cut pretty cleanly, and that's also because I'm using a really thin fabric. If you're using a thicker cotton or a linen, you might have to roll over a part just a second time to get a few threads off. So again, I'm not just going like this really quick to open it up. I'm slowly checking to make sure that there's no threads that are hanging before I open. And now I'm gonna move on to the last part of my skirt over here. This is the bottom of the skirt. And you might need to move your pattern weights around, so I move them closer to the edge. And I'm getting as close to the edge of the bottom of my skirt pattern as I can. Then I'm slowly checking to make sure there's no threads. Nope, there were no threads hanging. Okay, and then before you remove your pattern weights, what I like to check for are the notches. So the notches are the little marks that you might have made when you cut out your pattern. And I can see a little notch. Let me show you. Right here on my pattern, I drew a notch. And that notch might be to remind me that this part of the skirt connects to another part of the skirt. So this notch is important. And what I usually do is make sure that the pattern is right lined up with the fabric before you cut anything. You don't have to do this. Some people maybe use like a drawing pencil and they draw it on their fabric, but for me, I just clip a teeny tiny clip right on the notch, just to help me remember, oh, that part of the fabric is really important to remember. And then I just move this aside. So I will just kind of fold it since I don't have a ton of space. And I like to keep my pattern piece on the fabric until I use it, just so I remember, oh yeah, this is the front. I already cut the front. So I'm gonna move that aside. And then my next piece that I'm gonna work on is the back of my skirt. The back of my skirt, again, I'm gonna check to see if it needs to be cut on the fold, and this one needs to be cut on the fold. You see how I wrote that down? So I would line it up here on this side again. I'm gonna move my fabric over and do that again. But so I'm not gonna show you that because that's the same thing as the back of the skirt. But what I am gonna show you next is another part of the skirt, like maybe the pocket, because it's a different shape and it's not gonna go on the fold of the fabric, it's gonna go in the middle of the fabric. So I'll show you that next. Okay, so my pocket, here's the grain line, and I'm gonna line that grain line up with the selvage. Now I watched one sewing tutorial that I paid for before, and the lady actually got a ruler and she measured the distance between the selvage and her grain line just to make sure it was truly straight against the selvage. You can do that. I'm just gonna be real and tell you that I don't do that. It takes a lot of time and I am not a perfectionist. So I just kind of do my best to make sure, you know, it's not gonna be laying like this, that it's not at all parallel to the selvage. So I just do my best to line it up as close to be parallel to the selvage as I can. And then I just check to make sure that I have enough room that I'm not gonna accidentally cut it like this and a part of the pocket doesn't get cut, right? So make sure to line everything up properly. And again, just like I did before, smooth everything out, make sure that nothing is wrinkled. Mine is a little wrinkled, yours should not be. And then place your pattern weights on top. And as you're placing your weights, just smooth it out and make sure that everything is flat before you start cutting. And then I'll show you how I cut really slow with my rotary knife around. That's what's so great about a rotary knife, is it's really good for all of this round and all of these tricky edges over here. Okay, so I got my rotary knife ready. I'm holding it the proper way. I'm gonna start from the straight edge. It's pretty straight. It has a tiny bit of a curve. And when you're cutting, here's a helpful tip too. I don't think I mentioned this before, but when I start cutting, my pattern is right here. I'm gonna cut slightly below that. So if my pattern is here, I'm actually starting down here. And the reason for that is because when I cross and I start doing this side, it's just much easier to cut those edges. So always start just a little bit below the pattern, or if I was cutting this way, instead of starting here where my pattern is at, I would start back just a little bit. So you want to backtrack just a little bit to make it easier to cut all of these edges. So I started a little bit back behind the pattern, and then I'm using my other hand to hold the pattern down, but also to make sure that everything is flat and smooth. And then again, I'm right here at the edge of my pattern, but I'm going to keep going just a little bit off of the pattern. Then, you know, you can go whatever way you want, whatever direction you want, but again, I'm not starting right at the pattern, I'm starting a little bit below the pattern, just to give myself a start and to connect that cross right there where those points meet. And I'm going a little bit at a time. And then I personally like to get the satisfaction of pulling a little bit off to see the clean edges. I like that. You don't have to do that. You can wait until the end, but I like to kind of see if everything was cut cleanly. And then I'm just slowly going around these round parts over here. And what's nice about the rotary knife is if you have a good clean blade, you don't have to press down too hard. I'm not really pressing down too hard. It might look like it, but oh look, there's a little tiny thread that got stuck when I was opening it. So I'm just gonna go back, cut that little thread, and now it's opening all the way. So I'm still moving around my weights if I need to. If I see that the pattern might be creeping up a little bit, I move my pattern weights closer to it to make sure that it's holding down firm and you're cutting out the right size. Because if you cut it and your pattern's not flat, you might accidentally cut out a size too big or a size too small. You know what I love is the sound that it makes when you're cutting the fabric. It's pretty soothing. And then go back and check for any threads that were stuck on there. And I'm almost done with my pocket. I'm going to finish off this edge. And then, got it. And then I'm going to check for any notches, just like I did in the beginning in that first pattern. So I like to just kind of pin my pattern onto my fabric to make sure it doesn't move around. And I see a lot of notches on my pocket, probably because I'm gonna have to line this up with parts of the skirt. So I see a notch right here that I marked, a notch on the opposite side, and I have a notch right here on the top. So I just get my scissors. These are my scissors that I use for cutting thread or for cutting just really tiny parts and for embroidering. And I'm just giving it a tiny snip right on the edge of my fabric, because once I remove this pattern, I want to be able to see, oh, that was the notch that the pattern maker wanted me to have, because it just makes it helpful for you later on when you're sewing your pattern together. Okay, so then I move this aside, scoop my fabric over, and work on whatever is the next piece for my pattern.